From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Hans Coetzee and Andrew Curtis will discuss their new research finding on how anaplasmosis affects dairy herd production. They discovered that this disease can greatly reduce herd milk output. Then K-State's Justin Waggoner talks about a few things for you producers to think about as you plan to plant your silage crops this spring. That is a prelude to 2 silage schools being co-hosted by K-State in early May. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Ward Upham will talk about which landscape and garden plants likely did and didn't withstand the freezing temperatures in Kansas this past week. All this and more right here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You're tuned into the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. On our first segment, we want to brief you on something that was just announced out of the College of Veterinary Medicine at Kansas State University. It's new information regarding a bovine disease recognized by folks in the beef cattle industry, but there's an added impact from it that has just been confirmed by our guests now. Joining us from the Anatomy and Physiology Department of the College of Veterinary Medicine, Professor Hans Coetzee, and doctoral student in physiology, Andrew Curtis. Hans, what we're referring to here is anaplasmosis disease, and this has been a bane of the cattle industry for a long time, hasn't it?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today. So our research group has been actively investigating anaplasmosis in Kansas because this, as you pointed out, is a significant challenge for cattle producers in the state. So for those listeners who are not familiar with anaplasmosis, it's a blood parasite, so it lives inside the red blood cells of the animal. And it's very readily transmitted primarily through ticks, where it actually multiplies inside the tick and is spread that way. But it also can spread effectively through biting flies and then also through contaminated equipment. So dirty injection needles are probably the most common way in which the disease spreads. And so we run into challenges with the disease causing anemia or loss of the red cells in the animal, and that obviously makes it difficult for the animal to be able to circulate oxygen in its body. And so those animals become very lethargic. Their mucous membranes, so the membranes around the eyes and in the gums, become very yellow due to the disease, and that's because of the breakdown of the red cells. And then the animals can often abort, so they'll lose their calves, and they usually spike a very significant fever. So we commonly see anaplasmosis in Kansas in October, so it's usually a fall disease because the animals are exposed to the infection in the summertime, and it has a long incubation period. It usually takes about 2 months before they show those clinical signs. So this is a disease that we constantly struggle with in cattle production here in Kansas.
And putting it plainly, preventing anaplasmosis has been ultra challenging, to say the least, right?
That's correct. We don't currently have an approved vaccine for the disease. There is an experimental vaccine that is available under license, but it's not approved by USDA. And in many parts of the state, we try to control anaplasmosis by putting chlortetracycline, which is an antibiotic, in the mineral at certain times of the year to try to prevent the animals from dying from the infection. But both these control strategies are not very effective in preventing the clinical infection of anaplasmosis in our herds here in the state and across the United States.
Well, as a matter of fact, anaplasmosis is largely the centerpiece of Andrew's research work here at K-State. And you've gathered some data. We've talked about it before, Andrew, on anaplasmosis prevalence. And upon reviewing that data, you came upon a discovery of relevance to the dairy industry now, you say.
That's right, Eric. And so this is a little unusual in that a lot of the literature that's been written in regards to anaplasmosis focuses on beef cattle. And so we had an opportunity to revisit some data generated by Dr. Coetzee and others after examining serology associated with cattle at a dairy in Iowa, actually. So not only is it a little unusual in that it's at a dairy, but it's actually in what many would consider a state that's not endemic for anaplasmosis to begin with. And so historically it's been seen as a disease sort of sequestered to the southeastern part of the United States. That's really not the case, but at any rate, the literature was not bursting at the seams with information on the impact that anaplasmosis has on the dairy industry in the United States. We saw this as an opportunity to take advantage of data already generated and really shed some light on the impact that anaplas has on dairy cattle.
So you started digging, and what you found was that there is a pretty significant percentage of a given herd population with anaplasmosis in the dairy sector.
Oh, that's right. And so Dr. Coetzee actually had been involved previously with some work that had looked to quantify the seroprevalence among dairy cattle, and there's been some work done in Illinois and Louisiana and places like that. This work was actually all done at a single dairy with one pretty distinctive feature in that they didn't do anything in terms of quarantining newly purchased animals that were brought into the herd. This sort of set them up, it would set them up for a failure of biosecurity. And we think that might be a hallmark of this particular case, in that animals that were not necessarily vetted prior to introduction were introduced and then had an opportunity to serve as reservoirs for new infection, particularly to naive animals already on site.
And in this particular herd, what, as much as 38% of the animals testing positive for anaplas?
That's right. And so what preempted this was a pretty high death loss that the proprietor had experienced. And so blood samples were collected by veterinarians who had a working relationship with the dairymen through a number of sessions. And we were actually able to look at the serology data, and we found that this had a pretty high rate of seroprevalence. As you mentioned, the 38%.
That is eye-catching, to say the least. But Hans, moreover, you and Andrew wanted to know what this means in terms of dairy herd productivity. We mentioned anaplasmosis as an impediment to breeding success in the beef cattle industry, but you were looking actually at milk production impacts here?
So yes, Eric, we were fortunate that this particular producer performed DHIA record keeping, which is the Dairy Herd Improvement Association, and that's a regular testing of milk production within the herd every month. And so we were able to take those records and match them with the blood records that we had so that we could see or try to analyze the difference in milk production between animals that tested positive for anaplasmosis on the blood test and the animals that tested negative. And what we found is over time, there was a over 2,000 pound difference in milk production between the animals that were positive, which produced less milk, than the animals that were negative, which produced more milk. And so this is very significant, obviously, for a dairy producer, because these animals don't show any clinical signs of anaplasmosis at the time the testing was done, but they were persistently infected carriers of the disease. So they carried the anaplasmosis at very low levels in their blood. And that appears to have had a long-term impact on the overall performance in production in this particular herd, and really serves as a warning for dairy producers that this could really be eroding the profitability of their production systems if this is not addressed.
That's a huge finding. So the message is to the dairy industry, be on the watch for anaplasmosis, Andrew. This was drawn, the conclusions from the data set that you had on hand, but you'd like to see dairy producers be at the alert for this possibility?
I think so, Eric. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that if new animals are going to be introduced to a pre-existing herd, they should be vetted. And you shouldn't make an assumption based on where those animals are coming from. You should not assume that they are free from anaplasmosis. I think that's really a theme that we've been harping on as a result of this, because the vectors will exist in places like Iowa now, and when animals are introduced to a population, those bacteria have an opportunity to be transmitted either by a fomite or a biological or a natural vector of some sort. And so you're setting yourself up for some pretty serious risk if you're not taking into account the serostatus of animals you're introducing to your herd.
By the same token, Andrew, you are continuing to work on possible responses to anaplasmosis, that vaccine side, if you will, perhaps an implantable vaccine platform that could someday be a solution to anaplas?
That could be someday in the future. We are using the vaccine platform currently in the context of a different vaccine, but we have used it with success in the past. And we wrote a paper on that basically limited the severity of disease after the animals were challenged with the strain of anaplasma. The vaccine implant is able to deliver a variety of vaccines in theory, and it's delivered subcutaneously in a way that mimics other implants that are used routinely in the cattle industry. And so although we're currently not using it in the context of anaplasmosis, it certainly could be used for that again. In the not-so-distant future, it could be used again within our lab group.
Hans, in closing, the battle will continue in finding answers to anaplasmosis.
Yes, Eric, I think we're just scratching the surface of potential control strategies in the future, but I think the key take-home messages for your listeners are to be aware of anaplasmosis when they're buying animals into their herd, to do the testing. The testing is relatively inexpensive. It's about $10 a head. It's not very expensive to do that. The second is to take care about the risk of spreading the disease through dirty injection needles. And the third point is if they are experiencing significant loss of milk or drop in milk production, to consider anaplasmosis as a potential cause of that production loss and to work with their veterinarians to try to address that issue.
Good advice. And in the meantime, you and Andrew remain on point with your research into possible answers to anaplasmosis disease in beef and now in dairy cattle, as it's been discovered that anaplas can take quite a toll on milk productivity in a given herd if it sets in. So thanks to the both of you for sharing your latest findings here, and we'll probably talk again soon about anaplas. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
From the College of Veterinary Medicine at Kansas State University and its Anatomy and Physiology Department, Hans Coetzee and Andrew Curtis reporting on this recent finding. And we'll be back with more for you after this break. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Agriculture Today continues now, and our intent on this segment of the broadcast is to let you know about a pair of informational schools for you producers who utilize silage as part of your livestock feeding routine. And these will be coming up, these silage schools, in the early part of May, co-sponsored by K-State Research and Extension and co-organized by our guest now, Beef Systems Specialist Justin Waggoner of K-State Research and Extension. We'll talk about the particulars of these schools and how producers can participate. But, Justin, as we head into the planting season and folks have silage harvest at the end of the summer on their minds, are there a few things that producers should be contemplating now to assure that what results at the end of the growing season is going to satisfy their herd feeding needs?
Yeah, well, as many of your listeners can attest to, a silage program has lots of different aspects. There's a lot of variables in that. And the stage we're in right now comes down to planning and variety selection. And what I would really encourage producers to do is to make some data-driven decisions. I know as we look at crop genetics have changed tremendously over the last few years, corn lines, as well as even in the sorghum genetics that are out there, to take a look at, what might fit their operation best in terms of tonnage, quality of the product at the end. Obviously, there's some big variables associated with that, but, it's certainly a case. Some years, we joke that silage is kind of the afterthought. Sometimes, it's either due to maybe a drought response or a crop failure to some extent, in a way to salvage what's left. And that is a scenario that is out there. But at the same time, there's also, we need to put some thought into it and have a structured plan as to what's maybe going to fit our operation best.
when shopping for silage genetics, so to say, there are differences in such things as digestibility, for instance, other traits, right? And those are things tangibly that a producer can lock in on?
Well, there's several different factors, Eric, but yeah, key drivers, tonnage, which is, obviously there's an environmental component to that, as we think about the cost, the digestibility, especially as we get into the sorghum lines with brown midrib varieties that would have a lower lignin content as a general rule. Those are all certainly important considerations. Absolutely.
But your point is you'd like to see producers treat silage as more of a primary crop than just a secondary afterthought, to put it that way.
Certainly.
And that leads us to what you're hoping to accomplish with this pair of silage schools, which are coming up on May the 4th and the 6th, respectively, one in central Kansas and one in southwest Kansas. So what's the inspiration behind these, Justin?
Well, first, I think I need to give a little bit of credit to Lallemand Animal Nutrition. This is really a partnership between K-State and Lallemand. They've really been a good partner for us in putting together these meetings and these educational events, and have a long history in association with K-State Research and Extension and really putting together some events. So we titled this series Power Your Silage Performance, just how do we get more out of our silage programs. And so we wanted to put them in 2 locations across the state and really get in front of a lot of the silage, aspects of the operation. Obviously we tend to think of that as kind of a late summer or fall enterprise. So doing it early spring, certainly makes some sense to get people thinking about some things. So, in terms of locations, we're going to be in Salina, Kansas on Tuesday, May 4th. These are an evening meeting. And then we're going to be in Garden City on Thursday, May 6th. The RSVP deadline for registration, obviously due to some of the new guidelines that we have in place, we really need to have an accurate head count for these events, just mostly for the size of our facilities that we've got. And so we've got some documentation there. So the RSVP deadline is April 23rd. You can RSVP most easily by contacting Lauren Kasten at Lallemand, and that's Lkasten at Lallemand, LALLEMAND.com. Would be the best way to reach out to Lauren and get registered for this meeting. We're going to cover some topics. The first one in our lineup is really talking about pack density and the importance of that, of getting a good pack on that silage pile, and just the how to and the why that's really important in a silage program. One of the other issues that I think gets often overlooked just simply because it's hard on a lot of operations to get a handle on how much shrink losses there really is associated with the silage pile. We know that those losses in some cases are certainly in the double digits. 15, 20% is not uncommon. How can we get that down to maybe a single digit number? We know that that's possible. One of the other topics we're going to touch on is kernel processing. If you're familiar with just the silage industry in general, this is a topic where I would say there's some degree of debate, what those benefits are. And so we're going to put together a kernel processing demonstration to kind of see some of the differences there. And Mike Brook Dr. Mike Brook with K-State is going to talk about interpreting a silage analysis. And, a lot of times, we get the results back, whether that's a feed test or a forage analysis, and we don't spend the time to digest or know what all those numbers mean. And so I think it's especially silage analyses, they can give us a lot of indication of, what are some of the things we've done well, what are some of the things we could do better possibly. You brought it up talking about starch digestibility and how that's impacted by fiber levels and different types of fiber. And so that's just kind of a brief rundown of some of the topics that we're going to cover in these 2 sessions. So I think it'll be a pretty well-rounded event that certainly maybe addresses some of the major topics that center around silage and getting more out of those programs. And the program is for those who make silage processing a routine of their operation, or for those who are maybe interested in taking on silage as a feedstuff resource for their animals. There's something for everybody there, Justin. Yeah, absolutely. And I would actually encourage, if there are producers who, maybe they've never put up silage before, but they'd like to know a little bit more about how that might fit into their operation. At this particular meeting, they're going to have the opportunity to interact with several key experts in the industry. It's also just a great opportunity to learn. I know at least every year it seems like I'll have a conversation with some folks if this is their first time that they've, cut a crop or harvested a crop for silage. And so I think, just getting more comfortable with that process. It is silage makes great cattle feed. And so if it's done properly, there are a few things that we've got to do right. And, so I think, it pays us to get the most value that we can out of these programs.
Well, there's more to silage management than we often give credit. These sessions to cover these important points in succeeding with your silage management. And it's a free program. There's even a meal included in the activity, right?
That's correct, in true fashion. So get a little education and some dinner. So
very good. These are coming up once again in the early part of May, May the 4th in Salina, May the 6th in Garden City. K-State Research and Extension partnering with Lallemand Animal Nutrition to host these silage schools, and there'll be great programs at each locale. The deadline for registering, once again, coming up quickly, April the 23rd. That is tomorrow, as a matter of fact. So take care of that registration by contacting Lauren Caston, as Justin notes, lcaston@lallemand.com, or if nothing else, you can reach Justin at the Southwest Research and Extension Center there in Garden City. Wish you the best with these meetings. Justin, thanks for letting us know about them.
Thanks, Eric.
Justin Waggoner, Beef Systems Specialist with K-State Research and Extension. These are coming up on the calendar the 4th and the 6th of May. They start at 4 o'clock and end around 8 o'clock in the evening with that dinner included in the midst of the program. Take a look at those silage schools, co-hosted by K-State Research and Extension soon. It's worth mentioning as well that K-State agronomist John Holman has amassed a wealth of information on summer annual forage performance for silage and hay purposes, field evaluations of a number of sorghum and corn silage lines going back several years. That is just about essential reading as one would settle on a forage type you'll plant this spring for harvesting as silage. Go to agronomy.ksu.edu, search for forage trials. You'll find a series of tables that looks at the varieties and points out their characteristics, whether they be a BMR, a dwarf type, whether they're photoperiod sensitive, resistant to green bug, the all-important maturity rating, and, of course, the tonnage that each of those entries yield, as measured at the 3 test locations, Garden City, Hayes, and Scandia. It's a quite easy reference to use. Take advantage of it at agronomy.ksu.edu. You are listening to Agriculture Today. We'll return after this break with today's agricultural news headlines, along with this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update, that provided by Greg Akagi, and again this week's horticulture segment where Ward Upham will tell us how well our landscape and garden plants endured our cold weather this week. Still to come here on the K-State Radio Network.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you, and next up, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. The Senate is ready to move ahead with that agricultural climate bill that has bipartisan support and backing from major agricultural lobbies as well. The Growing Climate Solutions Act was reintroduced this week in the Senate by a larger bipartisan group of senators led by members of the Senate Agriculture Committee. Senators signing onto the bill included 17 Democrats and 17 Republicans. The chairperson and ranking member of the Senate Agriculture Committee jointly announcing that they will mark up the bill in a committee meeting today. Senator Debbie Stabenow, the chairwoman of the Senate Agriculture Committee, called the bill, in her words, a win-win for farmers, our economy, and our environment. And Senator Mike Braun of Indiana, a lead sponsor on the Senate bill, said that if the country wants to start addressing climate change, then barriers have to be removed for farmers to get involved in carbon markets so that they can be rewarded for climate-smart practices, in his words. More than 60 agricultural groups and some environmental organizations also backed the bill. The Growing Climate Solutions Act would create a certification program at the USDA to provide technical assistance for farmers and forest owners to enroll in a carbon credit market. The USDA would also establish protocols for carbon markets, and the department would provide guidelines to producers on how to qualify for those carbon credit programs. The programs would then become USDA certified. The legislation comes as an array of companies have started enrolling farmers in carbon sequestration programs already to quantify and pay for farming practices that minimize tillage and increase organic matter in the soil. Other programs help producers to reduce their inputs, lowering their farm's carbon footprints in the process. An increased enrollment cap and new and expanded incentives are among the changes now taking place within the USDA's Conservation Reserve Program. With more on that, the USDA's Rod Bain.
The long-running Conservation Reserve Program is expanding its suite of offerings and incentives to eligible landowners. Farm Service Agency Administrator Zach Ducheneau says among the changes, an increase in the CRP enrollment cap from 25 to 27 million acres by the year 2023, higher rental rates, and new incentives such as a climate-smart practice incentive.
Establishment of trees, permanent grasses, development of wildlife habitat is hand in hand with climate-smart agriculture, because the more diversity you have in your ecosystem, the better your practices are for the environment on a grander scale.
Additional changes include moving state acres for wildlife enhancement, SAFE program practices to the CRP continuous sign-up, and expansion of the Clear 30 watershed and prairie pothole soil health programs. More details are available through local FSA offices or online at www.farmers.gov. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Now, in boosting CRP sign-up, the USDA will be looking to offset the drop in average county rental rates by offering incentive payments for various practices. Those incentives will encourage enrollment for highly erodible lands and areas that will improve water quality. The USDA will raise the incentive practice payments to as high as 50% and will apply them to both the general and the continuous CRP. And the administration is forming an interagency working group to address worsening drought conditions in the West. Gary Crawford has more.
A few days ago, in the wake of a growing drought in the West and a few other locations, Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack told lawmakers,
we're going to take a look at reconstituting the drought task force and resiliency task force that we had during the Obama administration.
And indeed, in conjunction with this week's climate summit, the White House announcing formation of an interagency working group, as it will be called, to address worsening problems with drought in the West. It will be co-chaired by the USDA and Interior Department. And Tom Vilsack says the group will have people from a wide range of knowledge and expertise.
To make sure that we're taking a look at the full range and suite of assistance that we can provide to producers, and to make sure that we do this in an interagency process to make sure it's not just the USDA, but we make sure that other departments that potentially have equities here are brought into the process.
And he said the working group will not only address short-term drought assistance, but long-term drought resiliency. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Coming your way now, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update, and standing by with that is Greg Akagi. Greg?
And we're pleased to be joined by Kenlon Johannes, who is the soon-to-be retired CEO and administrator of Kansas Soybeans. And Kenlon, as you look back at the 20 years serving as CEO and administrator, you've seen a lot of growth for the Kansas soybean industry.
Well, it certainly has. We've always looked at the opportunity to grow soybeans in Kansas as a kind of a leading-edge crop. We've expanded from east to west. Acreage has increased greatly over the course of the time. In fact, for a while, we were the only state to have continuous increase of acres for almost a decade. It has been exciting. The most exciting thing is my opportunity to come up here back to the Great Plains and Kansas and interact with the farmers that run the show. It's really all about them and their leadership and their need and want to plant soybeans and make them an exciting crop to work with.
And throughout the years that you've served as CEO and administrator, and you talked about it's all about the farmers.
Oh, certainly, right from the start. And I guess the whole thing, the setup before I came here was really critical. The Department of Agriculture, through acts by the legislature, had just privatized all the commodity commissions. And I think people forget that happened 20 years ago. And what that meant is the farmers could take more control. The checks were now in control of the farmers. They could do things more quickly and rapidly, and they wouldn't have to wait for the state to hold meetings and the state to write checks and do those types of things. So those leaders, the Neil Martins, Ron Westervilles, and I hate to start naming names, but they were two of the early leaders that really got the commission and the association in position to work together. The association was just gaining the confidence of the commission to do some of the work that it wanted to do. The commission was coming out of the state, and it was kind of a challenge because neither one of them had really much of a credit rating, much of a notoriety. Although they had done great things over the course of time, it just was a fresh slate for me to work with, which was kind of exciting.
What's next for you, Kenlon?
Obviously, retirement from this position after a little over 20 years. I'm actually will be continuing to do a little consulting. The Soy Aquaculture Alliance lost their executive director, so I will be contracting with them to kind of set them up and get them going.
Kenlon, we appreciate your time and thank you for a wonderful 20 years as well.
Well, it's been a great ride, as some would say. I've really enjoyed it.
That's Kenlon Johannes, who's the retiring CEO and administrator of Kansas Soybeans. He joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Greg Akagi there. Many thanks, Greg. And we'll be back in a moment. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
We're back now on Agriculture Today and time for this week's horticulture segment. Well, we had a late brush with winter weather earlier this week, and it prompts the natural question, what about plant sensitivity to those colder temperatures, even the heavy snowfall that fell and then disappeared earlier in the week? Ward Upham is going to address that topic with us, horticulturist at K-State Research and Extension. And it'll depend, of course, Ward, on the plant material in question as we look at our landscapes and our gardens. Let's start with those things that will probably be just fine coming out of this.
That's right. So trees, as far as the cold is concerned, likely won't be hurt. Down to about 25 degrees through most of the state. So if you're in a part of the state that may have gotten lower, especially down to the low 20s into the upper teens, then this may not apply. Regardless, the trees are going to be fine. Trees are going to be fine because even if you burn off the new foliage, it'll send out new growth and secondary buds. The problem we had with the trees was due to the snow. We had enough foliage out there that collected that wet, heavy snow that we had some trees split. And the reason for that is they were codominant. They had two major stems. If you have a young tree and you have two major stems instead of one of those needs to go. Mm-hmm. Or you could run into a problem like we had with those that are now mature but had those codominant stems.
Otherwise, ornamental trees, landscape trees, quite durable in such conditions, as would be ornamental shrubs, Ward?
That's right. And same thing with perennial flowers. They're going to be fine. May burn some of the foliage, but they'll come back from that crown, from that underground part of the root system. So they're going to be fine. So don't worry about them.
Now we move into the category that most will have questions about. That would be vegetable crops that were already out there in the garden setting. There are certain plants that have no chance of surviving those freezing temperatures of earlier in the week.
Yes, if you already put out your tomatoes and peppers, they're likely toast. I mean, they just don't take those cold temperatures very well at all. There are some, however, that if you covered, they're probably going to be okay. If you didn't, they may have been burned back. Those would include like potatoes, radishes, spinach, leaf lettuce, beets, mustard, all those types of things. We do have some vegetables, though, that are very hardy. They'll take down into the low 20s. That include things like onions and cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, carrots, turnips, and kale. So those, even if you didn't cover them, they're probably going to be fine. However, we do have some special cases. That includes potatoes, asparagus, and rhubarb. The thing with potatoes, even if you burned off that top growth, there are other eyes on that seed piece. And that will cause those eyes to become active, and it'll put up new growth. So even if your potatoes are burned to the ground, you're probably still fine. Just wait for new growth to appear. Asparagus and rhubarb, perennial plants, you can burn off the top and they'll put up new growth. No problem with them.
So don't panic with those latter examples because they will come back, although they might look a little singed by the colder temperatures. When we think about fruit plants in Kansas, they historically have been ultra-sensitive to cold, have they not?
They have. Those fruit buds are what we're worried about. The plants themselves are fine, but those fruit buds, what are in flower in most parts of Kansas now, are what's really, really sensitive. So as a rule, if you get down to about 28 degrees, you're going to lose 10% of those fruit buds. If you get down to 25, you're going to lose about 90%. And so it doesn't take a much change in temperature to make a big difference in how much those fruit buds were damaged.
Well, let's walk then through the common fruit types we find in Kansas gardens and their likelihood of pulling out of this.
Yes, so let's start with strawberries. Strawberries, if they're in bloom, hopefully you covered them. If you covered them, they're going to be probably were fine. Depends on how cold you got, but they are real sensitive to frost. If you didn't cover them, you're going to lose those kingberries, those blooms that were open, but they bear fruit over a long period of time. Those buds that were still closed, they probably weren't hurt. And so you still get fruit, you just won't get those early fruit.
And as a footnote to strawberries, you say, Ward, for the future, we may not be done with cold weather. You would recommend folks not cover their strawberry beds with plastic.
That's right. Don't use plastic. Use a cloth covering. Old sheets or old blankets, those work fine. What you want to do is make sure you have something that goes all the way to the ground, because what you're trying to do is more trap the heat that's coming up from the soil than keep the cold from getting in. And so whatever you cover, you should cover all the way to the ground.
All right. What about tree fruits, such things as peaches, apples, pears? We know the peaches will not stand for anything resembling cold weather.
Yeah, peaches, when it gets colder than 10 degrees below zero, you start losing fruit buds in the winter, and that happened this year. We lost most of our fruit buds in February when we had that extreme cold. If you did have some that did flower, then you're probably going to lose them too. And so you're probably not going to have any fruit at all, or if you do, it's going to be very minimal. Apricots, they came through the February thing with a lot less damage to the fruit buds. But this cold snap probably took them out as well. And so those two types of fruit, we're probably not going to do very well.
Are apples and pears, conversely, more hardy?
I think they're a little bit more hardy, but the other thing with them is we had excellent bloom this year. At least I did. And so because of that, even if we lose 90% of those blooms, we're still going to have enough for a good fruit crop. What you want with these plants is a apple or pear about every 4 to 6 inches. That gives you enough leaves per fruit to make sure you have excellent quality and excellent size. And so it actually may work to our advantage if you lost a lot of those fruit buds.
It's natural thinning.
It is.
And what about those bramble fruits, blackberries, raspberries, and the like?
Yeah, so thornless blackberries. Let me explain how blackberries work. You have a perennial plant with biennial canes. In other words, that plant lives year after year after year, but each cane only lives 2 years. First year, it just puts up growth. Second year, it blooms, fruits, and dies. Okay? So that February cold snap, if you have thornless blackberries, you probably lost the canes, what we call the fruiting canes. You didn't lose the plant. Plant's still going to put up new growth, but you lost the fruit for this year. Raspberries and thorny blackberries have hardier canes, probably didn't hurt them at all. And so if they didn't, then you'll get fruit this year. One other thing with thornless blackberries, we do have some that are what are called everbearing. In other words, they will bloom and fruit on current year's canes. If you have those, you're going to get fruit in the fall.
Well, there's a quick rundown of what likely will and won't come out of our cold conditions from earlier in the week. Okay, that's not once more to say that we're done with cold. Hopefully we are, but you never know around here. Ward, thanks for coming over and telling us what did make it and what didn't.
You bet.
Appreciate your time. Ward Upham, horticulturist, K-State Research and Extension, with us on this week's horticulture segment. And our time is away once again. Please rejoin us right here tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.